This is Nasha Kasha, a Ukrainian Almanac. 28 minutes of stories about Ukrainian life. Nasha Kasha is heard on 15 campus and community radio stations from Newfoundland to British Columbia. Vitayu.
I'm your reporter and host, Stefan Andrusiak. Today we'll travel to Montreal and then north to Spirit Lake. The land that today is Ukraine was in part ruled by Austro-Hungary in the early 1900s. Austria and Germany were Canada's enemies during the First World War. Ukrainians, even those born in Canada, never having been to Europe, were apprehended under the War Measures Act, and they were sent to one of 24 internment camps across the country. Today's program is about one of those camps, Spirit Lake, near the town of Amos, Quebec. We'll speak to two filmmakers who have spent much of their careers and their married life telling the story of Spirit Lake. And we'll travel to the camp itself in the Abitibi Region. For Ukrainians, going to the Spirit Lake Museum today is a trip to a place of injustice. For the people of Amos, back then and now, it was and is an opportunity for economic prosperity. I'll explain. But first, here's the band Lama from Ukraine, featuring Natalia Dzvenkyu. The song is I'm Not Saying Goodbye, Не кажу прощай.
Тоді здавалось, що то був останній раз. І поміж нами сотні миль, і не час. Я так хотіла, твій погляд ловила, але все було як у вісні, і все проти нас. Не кажу прощай тобі, над морем повний місяць вдалині. Я не кажу прощай тобі, над хвилями не згаснуть вогні. Не кажу прощай тобі, знаю, ти чекаєш вдалині. Я не кажу прощай тобі, моя любов зі мною мені. Тоді здавалось, що земля пливе з-під ніг. Я не встояла, і ти не зміг. Я так хотіла вдягнути крила, обіймати навколо світ з висоти орбіт. Не кажу прощай тобі, над морем повний місяць вдалині. Я не кажу прощай тобі, над хвилями не згаснуть вогні. Не кажу прощай тобі, знаю, ти чекаєш вдалині. Я не кажу прощай тобі, моя любов зі мною мені.
Playing a pop song like Не кажу прощай, I'm not saying goodbye, leading into a very serious topic like internment, is meant out of respect as well as the realization that life does move on. Прощай, it means farewell. Parting with a loved one or a good neighbor is difficult. Add to it your government formally declaring that you are less than equal, suspicious, even a danger. Rip that person from their belongings, ship them to a prison colony, work them. How difficult that must have been. Не кажу прощай. Прощай means goodbye. Прощання in Ukrainian also means forgiveness. Spirit Lake inherited its name from an Algonquin native legend. It spread stories that ghosts were seen rising from the lake. The First World War would break out. Ukrainians, because they had emigrated from lands controlled by the Austro-Hungarian Empire, were identified as a threat, and they were rounded up. During the Second World War, a similar injustice would befall Japanese Canadians. It wasn't until the mid-1970s that internment came to the attention of the general public, and in no small way, this was only thanks to the relentless pursuit of a researcher and a filmmaker. They, from time to time, are still taking out a mortgage to wake up their audiences.
Я називаюся Зоряна Гриценко-Лова і бувша голова Конгресу українців Канади в Монреалі і Квебек.
Я називаюся Юрій Логовий, я кінорежисер, я в індустрії фільмів вже понад 40 років, може навіть більше як 40 років.
Raised in Montreal, born in Montreal?
Ні, я вродився в Бельгії в транзиті.
I was born in Sudbury, Ontario. And those are my formative years. And then at 16, when my father passed away, we moved to Winnipeg, where I continued my school and being involved with the community.
How did you meet? She's from Winnipeg. You born in transit, grew up in Montreal. How did you meet?
I graduated in 73, and I really needed a vacation after 4 years of hard studies, and I decided to look at Canada, and I bought an old car, and we went all the way to Vancouver, and we ended up in Winnipeg. And then, because my sister had at Osseradok, she had an exhibit of her work. She's a painter and a gravure, etching, no, in English.
I happened to be working at the Ukrainian Cultural and Educational Center, Osseradok, as a student at University of Manitoba, and we were already cataloging all the artifacts at Osseradok, and prior to that, I was involved with documenting Osseradok's work. He came there to check out the exhibit at Osseradok on Alexander Avenue, and in course of the conversation, he mentioned he's from Montreal, and he's doing a documentary on Ukrainians in Quebec, and it's very difficult. I understood that because I was also very interested in filmmaking. This is in the late 1960s and 1970s. My interest was also in film. At that time, we had very few documentaries on Ukrainian subjects because the Soviet Union, of course, did not develop that. So the onus was on us as a Ukrainian community in the diaspora in Canada to do that which has to be done to document our history. So he mentioned Ukrainians in Quebec, and in that conversation, he was quite amazed that I was so supportive and excited by the project, and I got involved with that in trying to help finish Ukrainians in Quebec.
Mm-hmm. That's very commendable. You finish university, you want to travel, and you end up going to a Ukrainian cultural display in Winnipeg. Дуже чемний.
Well, at that time, I wanted to find myself. You see, I was studying French literature and cinema, and my heart was always with the French side. But there was a beginning of a lot of separation talk and independence. I even had a teacher, Léon Bergeron from Manitoba, who was a revolutionary, a Marxist really, but his teaching in French literature was so interesting, and in Quebec literature, to analyze the Quebec society and everything, it was very interesting. But I always felt I was not part of it because I was not accepted. On the other hand, being in an English university, I also was not, I went to high school in French, so my heart was not really with the English side either. So I was trying to find myself, and that's why I did Ukrainians in Quebec. It was to try to understand the history of Ukrainians in Quebec, try to understand myself, where do I fit in that society.
From Ukrainians in Quebec, how did you meet the story of internees of Ukrainian origin in Quebec?
Well, during the research, Zoriana had amazing books. She's a book collector and an avid reader. She reads a book a week at least. So the thing is, she had this book of Marunchak about the history of Ukrainians in Canada. And in that book, I saw a little notice about Quebec and the internment of prisoners, Ukrainian prisoners at Spirit Lake. And I said, it's impossible to I thought always Ukrainians were welcome to Canada. That's the impression I always had. Even the sign said, welcome to Canada. In 74, I was already working on Ukrainians in Quebec, and Zoriana was helping me doing the research. And that's how I said it's impossible that Ukrainians were interned in Canada. It's like, it's not what I understood. And then I had to phone a cartographer in Quebec City to find out where Spirit Lake was, because that doesn't exist anymore on any maps. So he after a few hours...
Beauchamp?
No, before Lac Beauchamp, Lac des Esprits, Spirit Lake, because it was an Indian reserve in that area. So what happened was according to Marunchak, he said it was in the northern part of Quebec. So I knew at least I had one kind of possibility there. But where? I look at the map, I look at everything, there's no such a thing as Spirit Lake. And then what happened was the cartographer calls me back 3-4 hours later. He says there's three Spirit Lakes in Quebec, and one is in the northern part of Quebec in the Abitibi region. I said, that's it, that's the one.
And we went there. We went with the equipment rented, etc., and it was a very rainy day, I recall that. Chances were that because of the weather we wouldn't go, but Yurko insisted because of the cost of the equipment. That was in 1974, around 1974. So we started the work, sort of building the awareness of the internment issue in Canada still from the early and mid-1970s.
So Marunchak mentions this internment camp in a book, not specifically stating exactly where it was. Were other people talking about internment at this time? I mean, was it front of mind? How did it bubble to the surface?
Well, it was a progression. There were already some papers and theses written on internment. It was there to be found, and there were individuals that started to talk about it. And in the case of Yurko, myself, and the team that we were working with as graduates from university, the contribution that our film made was it helped to put the internment issue on the map. Number one, Spirit Lake in context of Ukrainian history of Quebec. And then the next film which we made, because we saw that with the internment of Spirit Lake and our research on the 24 camps, that it begged a documentary, a feature documentary on all of the 24 internment camps. And we went and took that upon ourselves as a major project, doing Freedom Had a Price. And that was done with great difficulty because, again, to a large extent, we were pioneers on the whole issue of an internment. And in Freedom Had a Price, there's also because we're speaking about Spirit Lake, there's a significant section also on Spirit Lake in both the film Freedom Had a Price and the original one, Ukrainians in Quebec.
The biggest problem for our film was to find photos. And because of certain articles that appeared in the Gazette, because there was a young journalist that came to our house and he was interested by Spirit Lake. You see how things happen, it's amazing. Pan Matziluch came to our house, Danilo Matziluch came to our house, and he's a journalist at that time, I think, for the Gazette. And he wants to go to Spirit Lake to find out this thing. He makes a huge article, front page and everything. And then he finds out, interviewing these little ladies, old ladies in NDG actually, that their father was one of the soldiers, one of the guards at Spirit Lake. And they say they have negatives that Mr. Palmer here, the dad, had a collection of these negatives, and they were nitrate. At that time, nitrate...
We pursued the lead that there was an existence of photographs, and we found these photographs. This is the amazing collection that later we put and donated to the National Archives of Canada in order to permit future researchers to use them, and of course they're always used. For example, the photograph of the women and children as in Spirit Lake is an iconic photograph. Everybody's familiar with it. That is from the collection that we found, and that Yurko, when he got, which was these old photographs on nitrate, very dangerous because they are flammable. He made copies of it, and we used them to make our documentaries, because you need materials, you need documents, you need photographs. Decades passed with this whole issue, and we were also in search of the very last surviving witnesses of Spirit Lake and the internment, and we found some of the last survivors of internment.
You meet her at a cultural exhibit in Winnipeg. You like each other. You're getting along. You're interested in the same things. You come to Montreal and you're working on a documentary. Were you ever thinking that, okay, this will be a hobby, this is something I really want to do, but I'm going to go out and get a job and get a steady income coming? I mean, you're standing in the rain, in the mud, with rented equipment, worried that you've got to get this done. What was that like? Just tell me about those early days.
Well, this was a job. It was a job. Now, maybe it didn't get the finances that should have been, because again, we are a minority in this country, and we don't have our own institutions that were able to fund it. But we felt that these aspects of document were so important that whether or not we had the finances, we got them. It was very minimal.
I was making a living in the film industry, so I was employed all the time on major projects. You work 6 months and then you don't work, so you had to budget all the time. But all the profits went into my films, into our films. So whenever we made a little bit more money, basically Ukrainians in Quebec was on my credit card, and then I would pay it off. I mortgaged my house, I don't know how many times, or I mortgaged our house, rather, to get funding to do Freedom Had a Price. We lost actually $250,000 with that film.
When we were doing these documentaries, we also turned to, for example, the Shevchenko Foundation. They gave us a little bit of money. We turned to some organizations. They gave modest amounts. At that time, some organization gave $50. And sometimes we got $100. It was very modest, but there was a little bit of support.
Okay, but you mortgaged your house.
Oh, we mortgaged our house I don't know how many times. To do Freedom Had a Price, to do Bereza Kartuska, to do Genocide Revealed. Every time we put the house, we mortgaged.
I can also comment that this just goes to show the determination and the commitment that Ukrainians have to document history. There is so much that is not written about our history, and the onus is on us to do it, and there were people that were willing to make that sacrifice.
Nasha Kasha comes to you from CHRW 94.9 FM on the campus of Western University in London, Ontario. We're heard on CHMR 93.5 FM in St. John's, Newfoundland, on CKDU 88.1 FM in Halifax, on Local 107.3 FM in St. John, New Brunswick, on CJAS Radio 93.5 in St. Augustine, Quebec, on CJLO 1690 AM in Montreal, on CFRC 101.9 FM in Kingston, on CFMU 93.3 FM in Hamilton, on CKMS 102.7 FM in Kitchener-Waterloo, on CKLU 96.7 FM in Sudbury, on CILU 102.7 FM in Thunder Bay, on 101.5 UMFM in Winnipeg, on CFMQ 98.1 FM in Hudson Bay, Saskatchewan, on CFBX 92.5 FM in Kamloops, and on CIVL 101.7 FM in Abbotsford, British Columbia. Nasha Kasha is also a podcast. Subscribe for free at most podcast providers.
In parts of the first half of this program, you heard the music of Jason Sweeney all the way from Melbourne, Australia. The title of the piece is Night at Spirit Lake. Now, for non-Ukrainian residents in the area of Spirit Lake at the time of internment, it was a very different kind of experience. Back in 1914, Hector Otsier, the then mayor of Amos, Quebec, saw a business opportunity. The prisoners would need to be segregated, lodged, and put to work somewhere. Why not in his community, he asked. He lobbied the federal government to build an internment camp near his town. Food for the prisoners and guards, clothing, building materials, jobs, all contributed to the prosperity of Amos. Today, a museum stands on the location. We'll go there next in our report about the internment camp at Spirit Lake.
Na, 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 na. Na, 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 na. Na, 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 na. Na, na, na.
As for Hector Otsier, the business-minded mayor and jail lobbyist, he served only 1 year in office, but did go on to terms in both the provincial legislature of Quebec and to the Parliament of Canada. Today, part of the county carries his name, and on the outskirts of Amos, a new jail rises. Estimated cost, $126 million, 125 construction jobs for the area, 88 full-time prison jobs when it's built, and some prosperity.
Au bout des rails, une sombre destinée, dans les entrailles d'un pays nouveau-né. Dans des wagons, on vous a entassé, et sans compassion, volé votre liberté. Brave méconnu, on a bafoué tes droits, on t'a mis à nu, en inventant des lois. Toi le détenu de la guerre et ses rois, tout ce que tu voulais, juste retourner chez toi. Na 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 na, na 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 na, na 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 na, na 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 na. Dans le paysage.
The song has a catchy melody. The beat emulates, for me, a train carrying reluctant passengers into uncertainty. But the words are heartfelt. The song speaks about injustice of internment, of rights being denied, of laws being conveniently changed. Today, there is understanding about what happened here. And Jim Slobodyan is largely responsible for bringing that understanding about.
Yes, my name is James. My real name is James Slobodyan, and I'm the chairman of the Camp Spirit Lake Corporation.
His wife grew up at La Ferme. She attended the little stone church that houses the internment camp museum. It's on the very site next to where 10 prison barracks once stood. The stones that make up the church walls were gathered by the camp's detainees.
This is exactly, Steve, the grounds where the camp was situated.
Where are we in
right here
in the geography of this province?
Okay, we're in the place called Tresesson, a sector of La Ferme, which is about 8 kilometers from Amos. The camp was 3 kilometers to our left by 2 kilometers deep. On the other side, the village was called Linenville. It's where the families were interned, okay? But they were not surrounded by barbed wire. But over here, all this part was all surrounded with barbed wire. The railway is not too far away from here, eh? So on January 15th, 1915, they arrived and about a contingency of about 90 people, the families, men, women, and children. And when they arrived, it was minus 40, and there was probably one or two barracks built. They had to get going to build the other barracks and to get to work, because the following weeks, more people were coming, were brought in by train to be interned here.
Now, they were mainly from Montreal, these internees?
All the people that came here are from St. Michael's Parish in Rosemont.
Yeah.
Okay. And some of them came from Point and from the other part of Verdun. But
these are all parts of Montreal.
Yeah. Oh. But over here, the camp opened in January 15th and closed on January 28th in 1917. It lasted about 2 years. When the camp was closed, they weren't given like a paycheck to say, well, listen, here, here's money to go back. No, they were just told, it's over with. The camp is closed, and take all the directions you want, and left without nothing.
In the Kingston area, 500 internees were held in a similar fashion from August 1914 to November of 1917. The site, historic Fort Henry. We close the program with a violin melody by Miroslav Skorik. It's from a YouTube video simply entitled Cave Soloists Play Skorik. In the show, you also heard Daniel Rose perform L'Évadé de Spirit Lake from a CD of the same name, published by Camp Spirit Lake and available at the Spirit Lake Museum.
Nasha Kasha is also a podcast. You can subscribe free at Apple iTunes and at many other podcast distributors. Partial funding for Nasha Kasha is provided by the Ukrainian Credit Union and the Canadian Foundation of Taras Shevchenko. До милої зустрічі за тиждень часу, дорогі слухачі.